terms of getting things started, so our context for today is to talk about a global approach, essentially to development, and having a client from, in your case, from New York that comes to London that asks you to do a building in Sydney. How do you go about reconciling a firm that would have fairly clear ideas about how an office building should be produced in a city that you aren't yet familiar about? What's the process, and how do we ensure that we're sort of respectful of local fabric and deal with local context?
Well, I think that picks up one of your points, because when we first met with your team from New York and showing the schemes for London Wall, there was a clear understanding that this wasn't how things would normally be done in New York, and to be honest, it's not normally how things would be done in London, the way we were doing it. But it's really going back to the structure, how it's formed, efficiency, internally that we get that, and then externally you can explain, especially in the London context, about how you do things which maybe seem, why, what's the sense, but then we understand that that's the view that the Lord Mayor sees on a certain day of the year, or the view from St. Paul's, are all a part of the story. Then the whole thing becomes a lot richer, and also what the market wants in those parts of the world. So it was a journey. I think at the beginning, we know we're talking about, the kind of New York guy said this is not a typical Brookfield building, but it's a Brookfield building for a special client, and in the end it was taken by Schroders private bank. So they wanted something which didn't look like every kind of glass. They wanted something that was different, whereas other clients want the openness. So it's being very specific for local.
Mm-hmm. Well, Earle, had you been to Calgary before you were asked to do the biggest building in town?
Not at all, but we were there once we received the invitation. Remember, our team from Woodsbaggett were there 3 days after the invitation, and it was extraordinary because I think there's if one is sensitive coming to a new city, one can see things that perhaps you're afforded to with that sense of distance. And I remember waking on the second morning with jet lag, with the sun just rising up over the incredible flat plain to the east of Calgary, and the nanosecond after the sun rises on that plain, it just blasts the city with light. And then coming to realise how important that sunshine is, of 2,400 hours annually across Calgary as the most sunniest city, and the importance of that searing, warm sunlight, particularly in winter when it's out and it's minus 30 degrees, then became really some of the touchstones that recognised that some things couldn't click into place in terms of an architectural reference point as per London and some of the things I talked about. And Calgary then demanded a proposition that was very different and very much about motivations and a dialogue and a narrative that was found elsewhere. So I think that's one of the exciting things of working globally.
Mm. And Joshua, we asked you to do a design competition for what hopefully will be currently as projected would be the tallest building in Perth, and make a significant impact on the postcard of the city and its presence onto the water. So it's a 6-week process and then you coming to Perth. What was your sort of impact from having to sort of where you'd imagined it from really the anti-pole, come out to the other side?
The problem with competitions is precisely that you in some instances, we're not going to fly all the way to Perth for the sake of the competition. And I actually think that, to echo Earle, that though in a slightly different scenario, that not being aware of the site allowed us to make certain observations that we probably would not have made, or certain ideas, or maybe even a certain amount of daring that we might not have taken if the place was real, that then I hope we will successfully temper with our understanding of the city as we become more and more familiar with it. And so what we discovered was, when we first went to Perth, was a city that was vibrant and unique in ways that frankly we hadn't really expected. It had a variation not so unlike Sydney, which for us as Americans, Sydney is already, it's a Sydney that has harbors of totally different characters. We don't really tend to have that. We tend to have cities that have a monoculture. This is a city with a multiculture. And to see that in Perth, though it's a smaller city, it also had that. And so that started to make us wonder what would the monoculture have to be around Elizabeth Quay. It will effectively become another one of these. And what did that mean for the project? And because it's entirely a new build, that maybe affords other risks than you would have taken, but it still has a similar responsibility to build within that multiculture.
Thank you. Now, one of the things that we've been exploring at Wynyard is in many of our sort of Brookfield places around the world, we have basically privately operated but publicly accessible open space. It's really been the thing that galvanises a precinct together. Now, with Wynyard, we don't have that, but essentially the transit hall plays a function there. But we've looked fairly significantly at Wynyard Park, and we've brought out the Bryant Park Trust to look at that. And there's another model there where you have a very much completely privatised, completely public space, which is run by a trustee. But what do you sort of see as the role of the developer, and some good examples of where open space has been provided, but it's still effectively delivered by and managed by the private sector? You can take that. Oh, well, maybe the best go Earle.
You did that on purpose. But thanks, Ian. Sure.
I was going to, but this is not an infomercial plug. I actually really sincerely believe this, that in New York, Brookfield has had a pretty remarkable impact on the city, in that it has something called Arts Brookfield, for those of you who don't know it. And Brookfield takes on the responsibility of programming and managing public spaces, in their case always adjacent to one of the properties, but does it to great effect, and is now a 20-year resident of Lower Manhattan. An obvious example is what Brookfield has done around all the regions adjacent to the World Trade Center at the World Financial Center. It was one of the elements that you may remember got destroyed when the towers came down. It was rebuilt. But then there was a commitment to, if we're going to rebuild it, that we're going to program it. And it's become as lively, if not more lively, than Rockefeller Center. And unlike Rockefeller Center, which is really focused on predominantly Christmas, this has a 24-hour life, and with great emphasis on the summer months. So the city is now actually coming to this region that otherwise was forgotten. And that's really, really in large part due to that single commitment by Brookfield to program the spaces.
I think that the lines between private and public are gone, and the best urban spaces are where they're blurred. And I absolutely agree with Joshua, and it's been my observation too, that the arts program at Brookfield Place in New York, which is also destined for Brookfield Place in Calgary, is incredible in terms of how spaces can be choreographed and thought about, from those single meetings to the chance encounters. How, for example, in Calgary, the pitch of the Spanish Steps in Rome become the pitch of the stairs in Calgary, to enable them to be scaffold for seating and meeting, and not just the functional aspect of moving from one level to another. And I think that if you think about how we work, how we all prefer to work, we've just finished Deloitte in Toronto, where there's 18 different types of ways to work, but it's actually really more interesting working outside when you can, in those third spaces that I know you guys do incredibly well. And if I think about my commute, most evenings in London, I walk past a building that Ian's firm has done, and there's an amazing transformation of Broadgate Circle that has been done by programming restaurants and cafes that is completely transformational in terms of that part of the city, and enables the through traffic, enables the multi-level theaterette and promenading to occur, and also enables at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday to work there and to have team meetings. So I think that stickiness, that variegated and varied life are the key ingredients to make those spaces really beautiful in terms of how they blur between public and private.
Yeah, I think what most of us don't like, and apologies for the coughing fit, is where you have that line and you're not quite sure if you're meant to cross over. So in something like Wynyard, that's where we obviously work carefully that people feel it is part of their public realm, it is part of their space, and isn't so programmed so tightly that if you do something that's not been allowed, then you're kind of moved on. I think real public spaces have that real mix and that chance encounter, and it's also the unexpected. And that's what makes it exciting. And so I think if we can keep that going in Wynyard, which we are, and in other spaces, you can get the full benefit of that public and the private.
Interestingly, in Australia at the moment, we've gone, Melbourne was in the position of virtually having no floor space constraints and a fairly liberal planning sort of system based on a lot of performance, and we ended up sort of seeing some sort of quite absurd pencil towers and some really questionable outcomes, and Sydney was perhaps a bit more prescriptive, and then Sydney sort of becoming a little bit more performance driven and so on. So there's obviously a great tension there between unrivaled development and planning potentially sort of encouraging or stifling the development of the city. The architect plays a key role in sort of trying to mediate or the agent between those sort of competing interests. So, how do you sort of see that playing out sort of most positively?
Well, I suppose somewhere like in Melbourne, there have been so many developments. I mean, those residential developments around, especially around the markets, it almost seems like they're trying so hard for attention, and so the ones that step back from that and are a little bit calmer and clearer somehow seem to rise out and become even more beautiful in that setting. And I think in Sydney, there's some really exciting things coming forward because they're starting to not look like every other building, but there's a confidence to have their own character and their own identity, which is, I know it's a really exciting time to be in Sydney while that whole language is being sought and tested. So.
It's interesting working in London, particularly for a guy born in Australia. Where Australia and the examples that you mentioned in Melbourne and Sydney are very prescriptive and slightly, quite different to New York, but of the genre that it's clear what you can and can't do within bounds. London's completely different, and it's much more subjective framework based off some of the things that Ian and I talked about, and it's there's a tension there because as someone investing and developing office buildings, there's it's a development game in terms of what is the capacity and what is the return for a site and then how much is it worth, to the very important cityscape issues that are respectful of place, respectful of history surrounding monuments, and certainly some prominent ones, of which we just mentioned a few. So I think that there's a nimbleness that's required in terms of navigating all of those frameworks that is demanding, I think, even between the different codes between Melbourne and Sydney.
New York is seeing something we'll call exceptionalism. We have a very rigid setback requirement, zoning requirements, and to the extent that they are not followed, it generally happens on a project in which people feel it's an exceptional enough opportunity to forego the requirements, which I think is a pity and is in contrast to certain jurisdictions that we work in that have adopted much more of a performance base. And I think that's what I would understand the way you're describing London and other places, that there's not a hard and fast set of rules of which someone pleads exceptionalism to it, but instead the ability to, if you can show that it performs similar to how certain jurisdictions are now doing performance-based energy modeling as opposed to prescriptive modeling, that they trust that they will get a better result by setting parameters within which you can prove your case while still obeying the parameters. And in those situations that we've worked in, the results have, I think, been the happy marriage of being both exceptional, well, not necessarily our work, but I think the environment is one where there's exceptional pieces of work that is not coming at the expense of the underlying intent.
One last one, and I'll throw it open to the floor. Blade Runner's getting a rerunning, and I suppose that the Council of Tall Buildings is trying to be the antithesis of anything that Blade Runner sort of sees as the future for all this. But fast forward to 2049, obviously the tall building format is going to be critical in terms of population growth and seeing collaboration, bringing people together, and all of the knock-on effects that comes with. So, what buildings should we be aspiring to, and how should we be thinking of them as where we want to take our cities up for 2050 sort of and beyond?
Well, could it be interesting if it's 2049 is not that far away, but if you look back kind of 30 years, things change, but there's so many things stay the same as well. Yeah. So it'd be really interesting in this next round of where we've got the high rises. Are they the ones we've got now? Are they going to stay as offices or housing, or are they going to change? And how are they going to change? Yeah. And are the new ones? Are they going to come up at all? Are we going to have some kind of crisis or link to climate that's going to change all of that? But I think in 2049, we're probably still going to be able to recognize. But in Sydney, especially, some of the projects go forward that are planned is going to.
Projects that we're working on now have to be imagined that they're going to have to take that adaptation at that point in time, really, aren't they?
But I think I think this next round would be really interesting as we start to rethink and reuse the buildings we have.
I mean, mixed use is something that we're exploring more and more in areas where you may or may not sort of think that obviously a nice straightforward office building is good and a nice sort of process to go through with investors, but sometimes to meet the market or to get the activation, and so with Elizabeth Quays we're pursuing a mixed use tower with 3 usage in it for the first time. So, I mean, what do you think the key to success in those type of projects will be?
I have an argument to make that we're starting to see, and probably will see more and more, that for developments to pencil out, that they have to be at a scale, even though they're still a single building, a mixed-use building of such a size that it somehow borders between a mega structure that's more like a master plan and a building. And the question then is it actually appropriate for so much development to be done by a single architect? So will we start to see buildings that are massive buildings, but singular structures in which you may have an architect who acts as a building master planner, and then a series of other architects who would actually build within the conceptual framework that they establish, and that you'll see multi-authored single structures. I think that would be an exciting scenario, even if it weren't being driven by economics, but one which I would hope we would aspire to anyway. But I think the economics may make something like that more and more plausible.
In the London Wall project, that was designed so it can convert into hotels or housing all the way through its life, so that the whole system is to encourage that. And it would be really interesting if you did have all of those other architects coming in and doing their overlay. Yeah.
So I totally agree. I think you think about my home city in London, some of the most attractive office space is in repurposed warehouses. And our studio is over 3 different warehouses that are linked together. And there's a buzz and there's an energy about how you move between those. And that loose fit, long life of how you can repurpose structures for uses that can be accommodated but may not necessarily be forecast in terms of what the future might be, I think is really important. So the multi-use, the repurposing, the loose fit, long life, I think within the most sustainable construct in the world, which is cities. I mean, arguably and unquestionably, cities are the most sustainable construct on so many different levels. So how can you do that, and also then think forward about then how do you procure those buildings? And Joshua talked about some elements of that, and we're starting to see that despite some of the headwinds, that there are alternate construction methodologies that are really, really interesting and really powerful that could then factor into that new utopian vision.
So this was for Joshua specifically, where I was talking about architectural agency, which I appreciate very much, and I think we've made great strides as a profession, moving ourselves out of the role of generally beautifiers of skins and designers of elevations, which is, I think, where Josh was heading in his talk. But we're not completely out of that question yet, and I find that at least we do still have clients that come to us and ask for, give me a variety of aesthetic options. So I'm wondering how, Joshua, you would respond to such a client.
To be blunt, I don't think we would accept the commission. I mean, that's the reality of it. And to be clear, it's not that aesthetics aren't incredibly important to us. I often say it's wildly important to us, but it's between me and my therapist. And I can't imagine attempting to argue a building based on, hey, I like it. At least in my experience, whenever I attempted to do that, particularly being younger, the client could just as easily say, well, I don't. At which point, if you don't have the gravitas to sort of say it's my vision, you really, there's no discussion to be had at that point. And so maybe out of that situation, partly it's because of my unusual career trajectory that I was partnered to a very well-known architect, but also put in a scenario where I had a lot of maybe too much freedom. But so I was in this weird scenario where we got amazing projects, but I couldn't claim to have a vision. And so we had to create arguments to convince our clients to do things. All the while, again, I will say that in the studio, the beauty and the elegance of it is always something we debate, whether or not you agree whether our stuff is beautiful or elegant, but at least it's very much central to our discussion. But I simply wouldn't know how to respond to a client if that was a request other than no. I mean, we can't. Our job isn't to do pretty options for you. If the project doesn't have enough juice to actually ask questions, we're not really interested in it.
But do you
It's not a very good business model.
It's a very privileged one. That's great. But do you think that the actual, I would say, biology of the buildings that you're proposing only have one aesthetic solution? Or is that the aesthetic solution that you prefer?
Well, the latter, absolutely. I mean, that's also the beauty. There's a beauty and a weakness to it. The beauty is, sure, we may have 3, 4, 5 different solutions that can appropriately embody whatever the agenda and the positions are we took with the client. But because we're discussing it on those terms, not on beauty, we don't show them the other ones. We don't feel we have to. And it's a bit, in the US we have something called affirmative action, which has never been, this is a totally weird tangent, but we have something called affirmative action which has never really been appropriately applied, which is that once you have 2 absolutely equal candidates, you can lift the veil and you can say, I give preference to one who may come from a disenfranchised group. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's practiced. It's much more political. But in a way, we do the same thing, is that once we have 2, 3, 4 options, we then lift the veil and we have a dogfight about beauty. But that happens in the studio, not outside of the studio.
I want to take the opportunity that I have 3 clients, sorry, 3 architects and 1 client here. So my question is, a client for a big tower, the big developments that the 3 architects are providing, means that your clients are quite tycoons. Something that your clients are very strong people, strong personalities, strong corporations. So the architects here are dealing with people who are big, people who have, we all have the egos, but a client like Brookfield is a strong client. So we'd like to ask the architect, we are architects here, so how do you deal, I would like to ask about your practice, how do you deal with clients that have power to drive, they have power to convince, they have the power to might change some rules? Because let's say, if you work like if you apply, let's say the local regulations that we have in Australia, you can say, okay, the limit of the build is this height, the FSR is this, the setback is that. If you don't have these constraints, how you as an architect, with your offices, can be big or small, can address the powerful corporation, this strong client, this client that can drive a briefing, can drive the changes. So how do you level up this relationship? Thank you.
You've always got to understand you've got to listen. And I think that's probably one of the key. You've got to listen to what the client's telling you. Certainly one of the clients at Brookfield said that he likes working with architects who actually listen to what he's asking and isn't sort of just providing a response to something that they think is the problem. So I think as architects, it's important to listen, and then you can respond, and understanding where they're coming from, which is something that Josh and Earle both touched on earlier. So if you get that right and show that you're listening, you can then put forward alternate ways of doing things, but from that knowledge, and that they trust you and they understand that you know what they're looking for. It doesn't mean they'll always accept them, but if you have to come from that way, you're listening and providing alternates to how you can achieve what they want.
I think as architects, we're problem solvers at the heart of it. And there's nothing worse as an architect having a client who either aren't invested in what they're producing or have a cursory overview, and you don't have those parameters of solving the problem, right? Any architect can solve a problem. It's about identifying the right problem to solve, and there's nothing worse than solving the wrong problem. And having a strong client and an informed client is a much more enjoyable position. And we're privileged to have in London a number of very sophisticated commercial office clients and some very sophisticated residential clients. And that partnership, that collaboration, where you transcend the role as a service provider and you become a development partner, is something that then becomes really rewarding, as opposed to a reactive, non-dialogue based conversation.
So I'll just sort of add one sort of point from the developer's perspective, is that all of these relationships have been formed out of a design competition process. So at Stuart Harmon, our design lead, and we'll work with firms like Architectus locally for Wynyard, for example, and we will have our best go at sort of solving a problem, albeit in a perhaps a somewhat architecturalist sort of sense, but we sort of try to resolve these things. Then we have a long process to establish who's going to participate in that process. And there's some firms that would say that they don't want to go to Perth from New York, or they don't want to work with Brookfield, and I think that's also a good to sort of establish that. And then I think that competitive design process means that it's not the the end of the beginning in a process, but it's really resolving that you do want to work together, that you've got a rapport, and then perhaps it even resolves that sort of aesthetic argument, is that sometimes when you're working with the same architect for the duration, they come back each week with a different one. Do you like this one, or do you like this one, or do you, at least through the competitive design process, it really does send the whole team down a path together, and I think that's been ultimately quite productive.